Welcome back to Sleepy Science History. I want to begin with a question. One that may sound simple at first, but lingers in your thoughts like a candle burning low in the night. What if you could pause time for 24 hours? Imagine it. The second hand on the clock halts. The cars on the street freeze mid-motion. A raindrop hovers just before touching the ground. Everything's still except you. Does the idea feel exciting? Or does it feel unsettling? Almost too powerful to hold? I wonder, if you had this gift, what would you do with it? Would you wander into quiet museums and look at every painting without a guard hurrying you along? Would you slip into the middle of a busy square and finally hear what silence sounds like when an entire city is asleep but not sleeping? Or would you hesitate, sensing that holding the world still might not be as innocent as it sounds? Let's settle into this thought together. Picture yourself wrapped in a soft blanket, the night calm, the hum of the world fading. I'll be your guide, and together we'll walk slowly through this impossible day where time itself takes a breath. The first thing I ask myself is, what exactly do we mean when we say pause time? Physics doesn't give us a big red button we can press. Time isn't a switch, it's more like a river. It flows, carrying everything along. Your heartbeat, the stars wheeling overhead, the cells in your body, all are drifting on that current. If you could stop it, would the river freeze solid, like ice? And if it did, could you still move through it? You see, if everything froze, your body too should be stuck. After all, your muscles only work because time is ticking, atoms exchanging energy, little electrical signals racing through nerves. So here's the paradox. How could you keep moving in a frozen world? Maybe in this thought experiment, you're gifted a special pocket of motion. You're the one figure in a painting who can step outside the frame. Doesn't that image feel strange? Like walking through a photograph that has come alive only for you? And then another question. What does air do in a paused world? Normally, you breathe because molecules of oxygen flow into your lungs, carried by the rhythm of time. But if the molecules are frozen, how would you draw a breath? Unless the rules of this pause bend in your favor, the very act of staying alive becomes uncertain. Perhaps you've noticed how quickly curiosity turns to unease. We began with playful thoughts, wandering museums, listening to silence, and suddenly we are tangled in survival puzzles. Could it be that stopping time isn't just a gift, but also a trap? Let me shift the picture for a moment. Imagine you really could walk through such a still world safely. What would you see? The ordinary becomes extraordinary. A splash of water turns into a sculpture of glass. A bird hovers mid-flight, wings spread like a painting in motion. People on the street are statues, expressions locked, some smiling, some frowning, some in between. You could study faces as though they were artworks. The subtle crinkle at the corner of an eye, the way someone grips a bag strap tighter than they realize. Would you feel like an intruder, peeking at moments no one meant for you to see? Or would you feel like a careful observer, a traveler in a secret gallery of time? And then comes the temptation. If no one else can move, if every door is unlocked and every vault unguarded, what stops you from taking whatever you want? Money, jewels, secrets. The pause offers both freedom and responsibility. It whispers, no one will know, but you, still breathing, still thinking, would know. Do you think such a burden would grow heavy after a while? Even heavier than the treasures you might gather? There's another layer too, one I find both fascinating and a little haunting. If you pause time, what would happen to the sun? The earth spins to create day and night, but if everything halts, then the sky remains fixed. If you chose to stop time at midnight, you'd live in endless night for a whole day. If you stopped it at dawn, the sun would hover on the horizon like a painting that never changes. Do you think you'd lose your sense of time without the sun to guide you? Hours stretching into hours. No shadows shifting. No clock hands circling? Perhaps 24 hours in a paused world would feel like eternity. And in that eternity, loneliness might creep in. No voices, no laughter, no movement but yours. At first, the silence would soothe, like stepping into a library after a noisy street. But after some time, an hour, 2 hours, 10, you might long to hear footsteps again, to see a stranger's smile. Wouldn't you crave the chaos you once thought you wanted to escape? But let's not make it all heavy. Let's play again. What small, delightful things could you do with this pause? Maybe you'd sit in the middle of a bustling cafe, where everyone's mid-gesture, and sketch the scene at your leisure. Maybe you'd stroll onto a stage where a symphony is mid-performance, and look closely at each frozen musician, bows hovering, cheeks puffed. Or maybe you'd walk into the ocean and watch a frozen wave arch above you, a cathedral of water that never crashes down. Do you feel the wonder in these images? The paused world would be a museum of moments, a reminder that every second holds beauty if you only stop to notice it. And in a way, isn't that what we already can do without magic, without paradoxes? You can pause, right now, and listen to the quiet hum of your own breath. You can watch a leaf trembling outside your window, or a shadow moving across the wall, and see the ordinary turned luminous. So perhaps the power to pause time isn't really about bending the laws of physics. Maybe it's about attention, about noticing what slips by when we're rushing. The raindrop on the window, the laugh you almost ignored, the silence between two heartbeats. Still, the question lingers. If given the button, would you press it? Would you trust yourself with the stillness of the world? Some might say yes, hungry for adventure, for secrets, for control. Others might whisper no, afraid of the loneliness, the temptation, the weight of carrying so much power. And perhaps the truest answer is not a choice at all, but a reflection. The idea of pausing time shows us what we value. Do we crave quiet or connection? Do we want escape or engagement? I like to think of it this way. Pausing time is a mirror. What you would do in those 24 hours reveals something about what you long for in your everyday hours. If you want stillness, maybe your life is too noisy. If you want adventure, maybe your life feels too small. The fantasy tells us about ourselves. So here we are at the end of this thought experiment. We've walked through frozen streets, wandered into museums, worried about air molecules, and smiled at suspended waves. And now I leave the question gently in your hands. What would you do if you could pause time for 24 hours? Would you race? Would you wander? Would you simply rest? And when the clock begins to tick again, would you be changed? For now, you don't need to decide. Just hold the idea like a small, glowing stone in your palm. Let it remind you that time, even when it flows forward, can be savored, slowed, and cherished. No button required. Good night, and thank you for joining me here in Sleepy Science History. What would it mean to touch a world that no longer moves? If you reached out to press your hand against a falling raindrop, would it feel like water or like glass? Would your fingers sink through its surface, or would it resist you like a frozen bead of crystal? These are the puzzles that slip quietly into the imagination when we linger on the idea of time held still. And they carry us into deeper questions about matter, about motion, about what it means to interact with reality itself when reality has stopped dancing. Think of the simple act of walking. Your foot presses against the ground, and the ground pushes back with equal force. That balance keeps you moving. But if every atom in the world is locked in pause, is the ground still capable of pushing back? Would your foot sink into the pavement like stepping into sand? Or would it rest on a rigid surface that resists you no matter what? You see, the thought experiment begins to unravel the ordinary in delightful ways. Each step, each breath, each gesture becomes a small miracle of physics we usually forget to notice. Consider light. Light is motion itself. Waves rippling through space, photons flying from the sun, bouncing off leaves, slipping into your eyes. But if time is frozen, do the photons freeze too? If so, then the world would go dark, the moment of pause leaving you in shadow. Yet if your pocket of freedom allows you to keep seeing, then perhaps you would walk through a frozen day bathed only in the last photons already on their journey, as though the sun had exhaled a final breath of light and stopped. Can you imagine that half-lit stillness, the world painted in colors that never shift? Would you find it comforting or eerie to stand beneath a sky that never brightens or dims? And if light halts, then mirrors become strange artifacts. Normally, your reflection meets you instantly, photons bouncing back in a dance too fast to notice. But in a frozen world, if no new photons can strike the glass, what reflection would remain? Perhaps you'd look and see nothing at all. Just blankness, as though you had stepped outside the rules of visibility. Or perhaps you'd see only the last version of yourself imprinted like a ghost, a reflection from the final instant before time sighed and stilled. Then I wonder about sound. Sound is nothing more than vibrations of air molecules, tiny pushes and pulls that ripple outward. If you tried to clap your hands in a paused world, what would happen? The motion of your palms might be allowed, but the air around them, locked in stillness, could not ripple. No vibration, no sound. Your hands meet in silence. Even your own voice would vanish, the vibrations trapped in your throat, never spilling into the air. Do you think the quiet would feel soothing, like the hush of snowfall, or would it weigh on you like a heavy blanket, pressing your thoughts inward with no escape? In such silence, your senses would bend. Vision might become strange, hearing absent, even touch uncertain. Perhaps you'd become more aware of your inner world, the drumbeat of your own heart, the whisper of your own breath. Have you ever sat in such deep quiet that your body suddenly seemed louder than the world? That is the kind of intimacy the frozen hours might bring. But there's another angle that keeps returning to me: movement itself. If you alone are exempt from the pause, how do your muscles know how to keep working? Your body is part of the universe, after all. Shouldn't it freeze along with everything else? Maybe, in this thought experiment, you're given a secret flame, a hidden current that keeps your molecules flowing even while others are still. That thought brings a strange comfort, that life itself is a flame, and in this suspended world you carry the only spark still burning. Would that make you feel powerful or terribly small? Let's wander further. Imagine approaching someone frozen mid-step on a busy street. Their foot is lifted, never touching ground. Their coat sways outward, forever caught by a gust of wind. You could walk around them, examine every detail, the way their shoelaces curve, the lines of their expression. But what would it feel like to touch them? Would their skin feel alive, warm, pulsing with blood that refuses to move? Or would they feel like marble, rigid and cool, as though their living spark has dimmed until time returns? The answer changes everything. One version feels intimate, almost sacred. The other eerie, like wandering among statues of the living. And what about falling objects? A cup tips from a table, coffee arcing through the air. You reach out and pluck the cup easily, the liquid remaining suspended like amber. But when you disturb it, does the frozen coffee crack apart, breaking into shards like glass? Or does it yield softly, flowing only where you touch, the rest remaining locked? It is these tiny details that make the fantasy so rich. Every ordinary accident becomes a painting you can step into. Every motion becomes a sculpture waiting for your hands. There's another question, one that carries weight. If you chose to act in this frozen world, say you moved someone from one spot to another, what would happen when time resumed? Would they stumble, confused to find themselves elsewhere? Would they remember nothing, as though reality had always placed them where they stand? Or would they feel a sudden jolt, a break in continuity that unsettles them without explanation? If you removed an object from a frozen hand, when time flowed again, would they notice its absence? Or would the world simply rewrite itself around the missing piece? These puzzles are both playful and haunting, aren't they? They remind us how fragile continuity really is, how much we depend on the steady flow of moments to knit our lives together. The more I turn this over, the more I realize how delicate the idea of pausing time really is. We imagine it as simple, as though the world is a film and you press pause on the projector. But life is not a movie. It is 1,000 interconnected motions, all unfolding together. To halt them is to break the weave, to reveal just how tangled every thread really is. Can you sense it? That tugging feeling that the world is both more magical and more precarious than we usually allow ourselves to believe? Still, amid the puzzles and paradoxes, there is wonder. Imagine standing before a waterfall frozen in mid-cascade. Every droplet suspended, every spray of mist turned into beads of light. You could climb the water as though it were a staircase, standing among arcs of liquid that never fall. Or imagine walking into a storm where lightning forks across the sky and remains, bright white veins stitched into the clouds. You could study the jagged shape forever, something no ordinary eye could do. Doesn't that image thrill you, like catching sight of the hidden machinery of the cosmos? And perhaps the most curious thought of all, what would happen inside your own mind? If everything else is still, but your consciousness flows on, would your thoughts speed up? Without the constant input of sound, light, and touch, would your imagination bloom to fill the silence? Maybe those 24 hours would feel like 1,000, your inner world spinning vast landscapes while the outer world slumbers. You might emerge with ideas, stories, dreams you could never have found in the rush of ordinary time. Could it be that the greatest treasure of the pause is not stolen objects or secret wanderings, but simply the chance to think without interruption? And yet, loneliness lingers in this picture. To be the only moving soul in a motionless world is to stand apart, to be both witness and exile. Would you come to cherish the stillness, or would you ache for the return of voices, of laughter, of footsteps echoing on pavement? Perhaps the fantasy is less about power and more about contrast. It shows us how precious the moving world truly is. The sound of a friend's voice, the sight of clouds drifting, even the chaos of a crowded street. When stripped away, their absence becomes a mirror reflecting what matters most. So I leave you with this question, one that hums quietly beneath all the others. If you could pause time for 24 hours, not to play, not to steal, not to explore curiosities, but simply to notice, would you choose to? Would you dare to stand alone with the frozen world, knowing it would reveal as much about you as it does about the universe? Because in the end, the pause is less about physics and more about perspective. It reminds us that every second already carries the magic of stillness, if we only stop to look. The raindrop, the breath, the heartbeat, they are already treasures. And maybe, just maybe, we don't need to freeze time to learn how to see them. Have you ever wondered what memory would mean in a paused world? If you were the only one moving, seeing, touching, collecting experiences while everyone else remains still, would those memories feel real to you, or more like dreams you alone carried? And when time resumed, would you feel a strange loneliness knowing that no one else shared in them? Memory itself is already slippery. How often have you remembered something and later realized it wasn't quite the way it happened? Now imagine memories formed in a world that technically never happened at all, a day outside the flow of history. Would they become heavier because you alone hold them, or lighter, like shadows that dissolve once the sun returns? Think of how we usually build memory. Through shared glances, conversations, the warmth of others being present. In a frozen world, those mirrors vanish. No one nods in agreement, no one laughs at your jokes, no one joins your steps. You would walk through streets where every person is a silent witness who never awakens to confirm they were there. Does that thought comfort you, like a private diary of moments too secret for anyone else? Or does it make you uneasy, as though your day might fade like smoke once the clock begins again? I wonder, too, about aging. If you live a full 24 hours while the rest of the world skips ahead in the blink of an eye, does that mean you age a little more than everyone else? A day doesn't sound like much, but what if you had this gift often? A day here, a day there, until one morning you notice you are older, lines deepening in your face, while your friends remain untouched. Would that feel like a secret cost, a slow trade you make for your private hours? Or would you accept it, thinking, these days belong only to me, and that is worth the price? And then there is the question of change. Suppose you chose to paint during those hours, covering a canvas with colors no one sees until time resumes. Would that painting still exist when the flow returns? Or would the pigments, frozen in chemical stasis, suddenly leap back into their prior state, undoing your work? If that happened, would it feel cruel, as if the universe itself refused to let your actions matter? Or might you smile softly, recognizing that this strange day was never about what remained, but only about what you felt while it lasted? Even writing becomes a puzzle. Ink flows because liquid molecules slip across paper. But if molecules cannot move, how can you write at all? Would your pen scratch in silence, leaving no mark, as though the page itself resisted your attempt to carve memory? Perhaps only your mind would serve as record, your thoughts the only canvas left. Doesn't that feel haunting? To know that everything you did in those 24 hours might vanish, leaving only echoes inside your head? And yet, isn't that already the truth of many of our days? So much of what we do survives only in memory. Consider relationships. If you could pause time, would you visit people you love, frozen mid-expression, and sit beside them quietly? You could whisper confessions into their stillness, words they'd never hear. You could hold their hand without them knowing. Would that intimacy feel tender, like a love letter never delivered, or unsettling, like trespassing into a silence they didn't choose? If you saw their faces frozen in laughter or in sorrow, would you feel closer to them, or unbearably far? And then the temptation deepens. If someone was about to suffer an accident, about to trip, about to drop something precious, about to crash, would you intervene while time was paused? Would you move them gently, shield them, correct the path? If you did, then when time resumed, their lives would be altered by something they'd never understand. They might avoid harm, never knowing why. They might live differently because of your invisible hand. Would that power feel like kindness? Or would it burden you, knowing you alone had shifted fate? This leads to a bigger question. Does pausing time give you responsibility? If you see suffering about to unfold, is it now your duty to change it? If you see injustice, do you intervene, knowing the people involved will never know who moved the pieces? Or do you remain only an observer, reminding yourself that the pause was never meant to alter the world but to glimpse it? Responsibility, after all, can feel heavy when no one else even knows you bear it. But maybe the truest use of those hours would be quiet rather than action. Imagine sitting on a park bench, surrounded by people paused mid-step, and simply breathing. No one asks anything of you, no schedule ticks forward, no clock hand chases you. For once, you have nothing to do but exist. Can you picture how rare that would feel in your life? To have time itself bow before you, offering a single day of pure stillness? Perhaps the gift is not in doing, but in resting. I sometimes think of nature in this paused world. A flower half-bloomed, its petals caught mid-spiral. A breeze that never bends the grass. A butterfly held between wing beats. Walking through such a landscape would feel like stepping into a painting, every detail sharp, unmoving, eternal. Would you kneel and study the veins of a leaf, the shimmer of dew, the tiny patterns of soil beneath your hand? Would you realize how much beauty usually passes unseen simply because it refuses to stand still for you? And then there's the cosmic perspective. The stars will slowly overhead because the earth spins, because time moves. But in a paused world, the stars stop. Constellations freeze. The sky becomes a ceiling painted with light that never shifts. Would you stare upward until your neck ached, trying to memorize every cluster, every glimmer? Would you feel closer to eternity, or cut off from it, knowing the sky is locked in a pose it never meant to hold? It fascinates me how easily the fantasy slips between delight and dread. One moment, the pause feels like a sanctuary, a soft room carved out of chaos where you can breathe. The next, it feels like exile, a world emptied of warmth, a museum where you wander alone. Which side would weigh heavier on you if you truly lived those hours? Would the beauty sustain you, or would the loneliness press too hard? Perhaps it depends on intention. If you entered the pause seeking escape, you might find yourself longing for return. But if you entered seeking attention, seeking to see more deeply, you might find it a gift. What matters, maybe, is not the silence itself but how you choose to fill it. Do you treat it as a hiding place, or as a classroom where the ordinary teaches you something new? So I find myself circling back to this. Maybe the pause is not about stopping the world, but about learning to stop yourself. We already live in a flow we cannot control, hours rushing like a river. Yet within that flow we can pause. We can put the phone down, look at the sky, breathe deeply, notice the tiny textures of a moment. Isn't that, in its own way, the power we keep imagining? Not a magical halt of physics, but a human choice to stop rushing. Still, the dream remains. The button waits in the imagination, glowing faintly. And so I leave you with one more question. If you pressed it tonight and had 24 hours where only you could move, what would you choose to do with your memories? Would you chase grand adventures, Sculpt waterfalls? Intervene in hidden ways? Or would you simply walk, touch, breathe, and let the world, at last, stand still with you? And when the clock began again, would you carry those secret hours as a burden or as a blessing? Have you ever asked yourself what rules truly hold the universe together and what it would mean to pull one thread loose? If time is the fabric that weaves everything into motion, then pausing it for 24 hours is like taking a needle and carefully slipping it out from under the loom. But what would the tapestry look like once you did? Would it remain strong, or would it fray, unraveling into something unrecognizable? Think for a moment about gravity. It is not just a force pulling you downward. It is time entwined with space, guiding planets in their orbits, keeping the moon tethered to Earth, anchoring oceans in their tides. If time halts, does gravity freeze too? If so, the apple hanging from a tree would remain there, suspended forever just before falling. The oceans would be statues, waves locked mid-crest. The moon itself would hang in the sky, caught mid-arc, never drifting forward. And yet you, strangely exempt, could walk across the stilled world, a traveler through a cosmos where even the pull of planets has taken a breath. Would you feel safe walking across such a fragile silence? Or would you sense that the moment you touched anything, the delicate balance might shatter? And what about heat? Heat is motion, atoms jostling, vibrating, passing their restless energy from one to another. If time pauses, those atoms must fall still. Fire would freeze mid-flame, its dance suddenly solid. You could reach into the blaze and touch it like a sculpture of light. Ice would stop melting, coffee would stop cooling, your breath would no longer fog in the air. But if your body remains alive, does that mean your atoms alone continue to move? If so, you would stand in a paradox, a lone island of warmth in a universe gone cold. Would that make you feel like a survivor, or like a strange intruder trespassing where you do not belong? I wonder too about the stars. Light from distant galaxies has traveled millions of years to reach your eyes. But if time halts, does that journey stop as well? Would the night sky become a fixed dome, each star locked in the exact glimmer it gave at that instant? Imagine looking up and knowing that not a single photon more will arrive until the clock begins again. The sky would be a portrait rather than a window, an eternal ceiling that no longer whispers of movement, distance, or change. Could you bear to look at it for too long? Or would it make you ache for the faint shimmer of motion that means the universe is still alive? And then there's biology. Every living thing depends on time flowing. The heart beats, the lungs expand, cells divide and repair. If all of that halts except for you, what happens to the flower you pick? Does it remain forever fresh, unfading in your hand, a perfect bloom that never wilts? Or does it feel strangely lifeless, its essence trapped, waiting for time to resume so it can finish its unfolding? Perhaps you would discover a strange melancholy in realizing that beauty requires change, and that perfection, frozen and eternal, can sometimes feel less alive. But let us step away from the mechanics for a moment and consider something subtler: choice. If you had 24 hours where only you could act, what choices would you make when no one else could see? Would you enter places normally forbidden, slipping behind doors, climbing into towers, touching the artifacts of history without permission? Would you taste fruits from markets without paying, telling yourself that in this pause nothing counts? Or would you find yourself hesitant, unsettled by the thought of taking what cannot be given? What do you think the pause would reveal about your own compass, about how much you value honesty when the world offers you a mask of invisibility? And imagine this. You find yourself in a library, rows upon rows of books surrounding you. Normally you could spend a lifetime reading only a fraction, but now you have a day where no one interrupts, no schedule chases you. Yet here lies the paradox. Can you even turn a page if the molecules of paper refuse to slide? Could you move the words into your eyes if the light itself is frozen? And if you could, would you find comfort in learning, or sorrow in realizing that all knowledge means nothing if no one can share it with you? Perhaps the truest library in a paused world is not built of books at all, but of your own thoughts. What about time itself as a story? Every life is written moment by moment, one page following another. If you step outside that flow, Are you still part of the story? Or do you become a footnote in the margin? An author scribbling in ink no one else can read. Imagine walking back into the flow after your 24 hours and carrying secrets no one else will ever know. Waterfalls climbed, lightning touched, cities wandered in perfect silence. Would those stories feel like treasures you hoard, or burdens you long to share but cannot? And if you tried to tell them, would anyone believe you? Or would they smile kindly, thinking you only dreamed? There is also the question of scale. Time does not just move for people and objects, it moves for Earth itself. The tectonic plates drift, mountains rise, rivers carve valleys. If all of this froze, then in your one day of freedom the planet itself would hold its breath. Earthquakes paused mid-tremor, clouds locked above mountains, glaciers halted mid-creep, and you, tiny and temporary, would walk across a world that for once was not moving beneath your feet. Would you feel small in that moment, or vast, as though the stillness made you equal to the planet itself? But perhaps the most tender question is this. Would you be tempted to spend your paused hours with someone you've lost? Not in the sense of speaking to them. Time cannot bring back what has already gone. But in the sense of standing near them, holding a photograph, or visiting a place they loved. The pause would give you privacy with your memories. Unbroken hours where grief could stretch and breathe without interruption. Would that time heal, or would it ache even more, knowing that when the clock returned you could not carry them with you? I think often of how much this fantasy reveals about what we miss. We imagine pausing time not to gain power, but to gain presence. To walk more slowly, to notice more deeply, to breathe without the whip of the clock. The thought experiment is cosmic, yes, but it is also human. It reminds us that time already feels too quick, that we long for the kind of stillness we rarely allow ourselves. And so perhaps the deeper truth is that the pause is already in our reach. Not by halting the universe, but by stepping outside the rush. Sitting quietly, listening, watching the way a shadow shifts across a wall. Yet I cannot escape the haunting side. If you were given the button, would you use it once and never again, treasuring the memory? Or would you grow addicted to the silence? Would the world in motion feel too loud afterward? Too hurried? Too careless? Might you start pressing the button again and again, until the paused hours outweighed the flowing ones? Could the gift become a prison, where you drift farther and farther from the lives still moving around you? So I leave you with this final question. If the power to pause time rested in your hand tonight, glowing softly, whispering for you to use it, would you press it? And if you did, would you step into those 24 hours as a thief, a wanderer, a seeker, or simply as yourself? Someone who longs for stillness and knows, deep down, that even in a flowing world stillness can be found? Because maybe the pause is not about stopping time at all. Maybe it is about remembering that time does not own you. You can step aside, breathe, and let the world rush past while you remain, for a moment entirely still. What does freedom really mean if the world cannot move with you? We often picture freedom as having endless choices, wide horizons, paths opening in every direction. But if you are the only one who can move in a paused world, is that freedom, or is it a different kind of confinement? After all, you can go anywhere, touch anything, see everything, but you cannot share it, cannot be answered, cannot be truly seen. Is freedom still freedom when it leaves you entirely alone? Imagine walking into a marketplace frozen at the height of its energy. Stalls brimming with fruits and spices, children mid-laugh, birds in the rafters of the roof, all held in perfect suspension. You could walk through aisles that smell of cinnamon and earth, reach out to touch the smooth skin of an apple or the rough edge of a basket. But as you move, not a single voice rises, not a hand gestures, not an eye meets yours. Would you feel like a king with endless treasures, or like a ghost wandering through the living who do not know you are there? And what about touch itself? If you placed your hand on the shoulder of someone you love, would they feel it when time resumed? Would the atoms of their body remember your warmth? Or would it vanish like mist the moment the pause ended? If no imprint remained, would you still find comfort in the act? Or would it feel hollow, like embracing a statue carved too perfectly? Think also of morality. When no one can move but you, what rules apply? Laws are built on the assumption that we all act within the same flowing stream, that actions have consequences others can witness. In a paused world, that balance breaks. You could trespass anywhere, read hidden letters, hold secrets never meant for your eyes. No judge could punish you, no friend could stop you. But would you stop yourself? Would you create your own laws to keep from drifting into temptation? Or would you let curiosity carry you past boundaries you once respected, convincing yourself it harmed no one if no one knew? Even the idea of harm shifts. Suppose a glass slips from someone's hand. In pause time, you catch it, preventing it from shattering. When the world resumes, they never realize the disaster that was averted. You saved them from trouble, but they do not know. Would you feel satisfied in that quiet act of protection? Or would you ache for them to know what you had done? Sometimes we crave acknowledgement more than we admit. Could you bear to do good without recognition, again and again in silence? Then there is the question of power. Power is not only about strength but about context, about having it when others do not. If you are the only one who moves, then your power in those 24 hours is absolute. Would it corrupt you even gently? Would you begin with small acts, moving a coin from a table, sketching on a wall, and end with larger ones, shifting entire events to your liking? Or would the weight of such potential paralyze you, leaving you afraid to touch anything at all, lest you alter the fabric of lives without consent? I find myself thinking about art. If you wandered into a gallery during a pause, every brushstroke would be yours alone to study. You could stand so close to a painting that your breath would fog the canvas, and no guard would usher you back. Yet art, in its truest form, is a conversation. The artist speaks, the viewer answers with feeling, and others around you create a shared hum of awe. If you are alone, is that hum gone? Does the painting still breathe without the crowd? Or does it flatten into silence, a voice cut off mid-song? And music especially suffers. Instruments require vibration. Sound requires air in motion. In pause time, no string would quiver, no drum would resonate. You could touch a piano key and see it dip, but no note would reach your ear. Imagine walking into a concert hall where a symphony is frozen mid-performance. Every bow lifted, every mouth open to the song, and not a single sound in the air. Would you walk among them like a traveler in a sculpture garden? Or would you close your eyes and try to hear the music in your imagination, filling the silence with what you remember? I wonder, too, how your sense of self might shift. In a world where everyone is frozen, you are the only proof of life. Every laugh, every gesture, every sound comes from you alone. Does that make you feel expanded, like the central character in existence, or diminished, like a single flicker of light in an ocean of stillness? If the pause lasted too long, might you even begin to doubt yourself? To ask, am I still real if no one else can move with me? And then comes the thought of time resuming. If you knew the world would awaken exactly as you left it, would you prepare little surprises? A flower placed in someone's hand, a note tucked in a pocket, a chair moved slightly from its place. When they awoke, would they wonder what had changed? Would they dismiss it as coincidence? Or would they feel, deep in their bones, that something unexplainable brushed against their lives? And how would it feel to know you alone held the answer? The natural world offers other puzzles. Imagine pausing time in the middle of a forest. The wind stops rustling leaves, streams turn to glass, birds are sculptures in the branches. If you walk across a pond, would the water remain firm beneath your feet, frozen in fluid form? Or would you sink into it as if breaking through fragile glass? Would the air itself resist your movement, molecules stiff like sand you must push through? Or would your pocket of freedom carve a bubble where air flows only for you? The longer you sit with the idea, the more it becomes less about science and more about philosophy. To pause time is to ask, what is the value of a moment? Is its worth in the doing, in the acting, in the sharing, or is it in the simple being? If the world stood still, would you spend your 24 hours racing through cities, touching every artifact, claiming every hidden corner? Or would you spend it lying in the grass, watching a sky that never changes, marveling at the idea that for once, nothing is slipping away from you? I think the temptation would vary with each person. Someone restless might roam continents, sprinting through frozen airports, stepping into palaces, climbing mountains that normally require permits and patience. Another might linger with loved ones, studying their faces in stillness, whispering words they'll never hear. Another might simply sleep, enjoying a rest uninterrupted by alarms, knowing they are the only one allowed to do so. And perhaps that is the real beauty of the thought. The pause reveals not the world, but the self. Whatever you long for most, the pause offers in abundance. Yet there is danger in abundance. Too much solitude becomes isolation. Too much freedom becomes temptation. Too much stillness becomes stagnation. Could it be that the pause is beautiful only because it is temporary, because the clock will resume? Would it lose its meaning if it stretched forever? If you alone wandered while centuries slipped unnoticed by those around you? Would eternity in a paused world be heaven, or would it quietly unravel into a kind of purgatory? And so I leave you with a question that rests deeper than all the rest. If you were offered the power to pause time for 24 hours, but knew you could use it only once in your entire life, how would you spend that one day? Would you chase the unreachable, touch the untouchable, or simply savor the ordinary in its stillness? And when time returned, would you look back on that day as your greatest adventure, or as a reminder that sometimes the most precious moments are the ones that move, fragile and fleeting, but shared with others in the flow of time? What does motion mean if you are the only one who can create it? Every step, every blink, every shift of breath belongs to you alone while the world holds still. Would movement feel like a gift, or would it become a weight, reminding you with each gesture that you are the solitary ripple in a vast and silent sea? Think for a moment about language. Words are not just sounds. They are exchanges, carried between people by vibrations of air and the turning of time. If you called someone's name in a paused world, no echo would answer. The air would not ripple, and no voice would rise to meet yours. Would you keep speaking anyway, whispering your thoughts into the frozen silence, or would you fall quiet, realizing words lose their meaning without another to hear? Could you stand in front of a loved one, their lips parted in some half-finished sentence, and answer them knowing they will never receive it? And then there is hunger. Your body does not pause with the world. It carries on, heart beating, stomach growling, cells demanding energy. But food, what happens to food when time has halted? If molecules cannot move, bread remains stiff, water remains locked, fruits remain firm with no sweetness flowing. Could you even chew or swallow or digest? Or would your exemption from stillness grant you a strange privilege, allowing food to shift in your hands, to break, to nourish? If not, the pause would become a test of endurance, a quiet fasting where you alone are alive but cannot eat. Would 24 hours stretch into a trial of patience, teaching you how fragile the body is when denied the flow it depends on? What of animals? Picture a flock of birds in mid-flight, wings frozen wide as though the sky itself became a painting. Would you reach out and touch a feather midair, marveling at the softness held in place by a law larger than yourself? Or would it trouble you, seeing creatures that once moved with freedom caught as though snared? Could you kneel beside a deer paused in mid-step, its eyes wide and glossy, and not feel an ache at the stillness? Perhaps the pause reminds us that life is precious only because it refuses to remain still. And yet, in that stillness lies another kind of beauty. Imagine standing on the shore while a wave rises before you, high and curling, its foam frozen in lace. You could walk beneath it as though under a cathedral of water, every droplet suspended like crystal. No danger, no noise, only awe. Or imagine lightning caught across the sky, frozen in its jagged path. You could trace its shape with your hand, touch the edge of power usually gone too fast to see. Would such sights feel holy, as though time itself offered you a glimpse of its hidden art? I often wonder about shadow. Shadows move because light does, shifting as the sun arcs overhead. But if light no longer travels, shadows freeze. Imagine lying in a meadow, your body stretched on the grass, and your shadow remains the same no matter how long you rest. Would you find peace in that constancy? Or would you long for the slow slide that reminds you of the sun's journey? Perhaps you'd realize that shadow itself is a quiet clock, one you miss only when it refuses to move. There is also the question of sound stored in objects. A bell, for example, rings because it vibrates, sending ripples through air. But if you struck it in a paused world, would it remain silent, its body trembling without release? Or would your special exemption allow the sound to exist only for you, a private song in a universe otherwise hushed? If you could create sound in a silent world, would you sing to yourself, letting your own voice fill the emptiness? Or would the contrast make the silence feel even heavier once the last note faded? Consider, too, the matter of sleep. If you lay down during a pause, would the stillness cradle you more deeply, or would it unsettle you, knowing the world around you remained unchanged as you drifted off? To sleep while the world is paused might feel like doubling the stillness, a silence layered upon silence. Would you dream differently, knowing no time passed outside your own mind? Perhaps the dream itself would stretch, unanchored, becoming vast and endless until the pause ended. Could you awaken from such sleep without wondering which world felt more real, the frozen one or the one of dreams? What about the stars? Normally, they move so slowly that we hardly notice, yet over hours they cross the sky, guided by Earth's spin. In a paused world, they remain fixed, unmoving, eternal. You could lie beneath them for hours, studying their exact arrangement, mapping each constellation in perfect clarity. Would you feel closer to the universe, or farther, sensing that its grand dance had stilled? Stars speak to us not just in their light, but in their motion, reminding us of vast cycles beyond ourselves. To see them locked might remind you that eternity without change is not life, but stasis. And what of art you create? If you painted in those hours, would the brush leave a stroke, or would the paint resist? If you wrote, would the pen mark the page, or would ink remain stiff in its cartridge? If you sculpted clay, would it yield beneath your fingers, or stay rigid like stone? If nothing moved but you, art itself would resist creation. But if the pause made exceptions for your touch, then you could build entire worlds in secret, leaving behind sculptures or canvases that no one would know came from a day outside of time. Would you keep them as your private treasures, or place them in plain sight, smiling as others wondered when they had appeared? I return often to the question of morality, because it lingers with sharpness. If you could act without consequence, what would stop you from crossing lines you would never cross in ordinary time? Would you guard your choices carefully, or would temptation slip into your fingers? The pause does not judge, but you would. And when the clock resumed, you would carry those choices with you, even if no one else ever knew. Would you be at peace with yourself afterward, or would your own memory weigh heavier than any law? There's also the strange idea of chance. Life depends on it. Dice rolling, coins flipping, raindrops falling in patterns we cannot predict. But in a paused world, chance itself is silenced. The coin hangs midair, the dice hover above the table, the raindrop waits before striking the ground. You could walk through that suspended uncertainty, knowing exactly what the outcomes would have been, yet never letting them arrive. Would that make you feel powerful, or would it unsettle you to see possibility denied its right to unfold? And then there is love. If you stood before someone you cherish, frozen mid-expression, what would you do? Would you whisper all the things you were too afraid to say while time moved? Would you place a note in their pocket, a secret gift they'd find when the world resumed? Or would you resist, sensing that true connection requires their gaze meeting yours, their words answering back? Love, after all, lives in exchange. Without time, that exchange cannot happen. Would the pause reveal the depth of your feeling, or its fragility? I find myself circling back, again and again, to the idea that pausing time is less about science and more about reflection. It asks, what do you value when the usual rules no longer bind you? Do you seek beauty, knowledge, comfort, mischief, or silence? And whatever answer rises tells you something about yourself. The pause is not just a window into the world. It is a mirror held gently to your own longings. So let me leave you with one last question. If tonight you held the power to press that invisible button, to pause the universe for 24 hours, would you run, would you rest, or would you simply stand still and breathe, knowing that for once time itself had given you space. And when the flow returned, would you be grateful it moved again? Or would a part of you always ache for the silence? What would history look like if you could walk through it while it slept? Imagine standing in the middle of a great battle, soldiers frozen mid-charge, flags caught in the wind that no longer moves. Imagine strolling through the signing of an ancient treaty, every quill suspended above parchment, leaders leaning forward with eyes unblinking. If time could be paused, you would not just observe history, you would enter it, move among the very seconds that shaped everything to come. Would you treat those moments as sacred? Or would curiosity pull you into places you were never meant to tread? Think of a library of centuries, all of humanity's moments stacked like books. Normally, we can only read them page by page, through memory or record. But pausing time would let you step between the lines themselves, seeing the ink as it dries, or never dries at all. Would you choose to visit great turning points? Or would you seek the ordinary seconds, the small lives never written about? Perhaps you would wander through a marketplace in ancient Greece, watch bread baked in clay ovens, children chasing each other across a dusty square. Perhaps those quiet, forgotten instants would feel more real than any battlefield or palace. And then, what of responsibility? If you walked through history while it was paused, could you resist the urge to intervene? To tilt a hand slightly so a signature becomes a different shape, to shift a soldier's step so a war begins or ends differently. You might tell yourself it would change everything, but perhaps it would change nothing, because when time resumes, events unfold from causes larger than your single touch. Or perhaps even the smallest nudge would ripple outward endlessly. Would you dare risk it, or would you keep your hands behind your back, walking quietly so as not to disturb the delicate web of cause and effect? Consider the scientists of the past, their experiments frozen mid-motion. Galileo dropping weights from a tower, Newton watching an apple hover just before it hits the ground, Curie leaning over a beaker glowing faintly in the dark. If you could pause time and step into those rooms, would you feel closer to them, seeing the exact breath they took, the moment before discovery bloomed? Or would you feel even more separate, realizing that knowledge is only alive when it moves, when it passes from one mind to another across the flow of years? I wonder too about art again, but this time through the lens of history. Imagine walking into Shakespeare's theater mid-performance, actors caught mid-line, audience mid-laughter. You could step onto the stage, whisper the next words before the actor's lips, feel what it's like to stand among a crowd that does not stir. Or picture standing beside Michelangelo, his chisel just touching marble, the first spark of David waiting to emerge. You could see genius in its raw stillness, frozen at the point of becoming. Would that deepen your reverence? Or would it make you ache that you could never speak to them, never ask the questions that rise in your throat? And what of disaster? Imagine being present during moments of catastrophe, a city mid-earthquake, a ship mid-sinking, a tower mid-collapse. In the pause, no one suffers yet, no one screams, no one runs. You could walk among them, study the fragile line between safety and loss. Would you feel tempted to change something, to move one person, one object, hoping to alter the outcome when time resumes? And if you did, would that act save them, or would the universe bend back, ensuring the moment plays out as it always did? Perhaps pausing time would teach you how much of life is balanced on the edge of inevitability. There is also the thought of seasons. Spring blossoms only because time lets buds unfurl, lets warmth deepen day by day. If you paused time in the first hour of spring, flowers would remain closed, trees bare, air sharp with cold. If you paused it in summer, fruit would hang ripe but never fall, bees suspended mid-flight. Autumn leaves would dangle in perfect flame, never drifting down. Winter snow would hover mid-flake, a million white crystals frozen above the ground. You could walk through eternal spring, eternal summer, eternal fall, eternal winter, but would they feel alive if they never changed? Or would you realize that beauty lies in their passing, that each season is precious because it cannot last? And then, what about the future? If pausing time gave you access not just to the present but to the arc ahead, would you dare step into it? To wander a city centuries from now, machines humming, people wearing clothes you cannot imagine, voices speaking in rhythms you barely understand. But if you pause it, you could never speak to them, never learn their words, only watch their faces locked in expressions you cannot read. Would that glimpse satisfy your curiosity, or would it torment you to know what was coming but never be able to join it? Imagine, too, the loneliness of pausing time again and again, watching centuries unfold in between your stolen days. You might live to see empires rise and fall, technologies born and forgotten, faces shifting endlessly. Yet each time you pause, you would be alone, the sole witness to seconds that no one else remembers. Would you feel like a guardian of history, or like a shadow walking through the halls of time, unseen, unacknowledged, untouchable? There is another question that clings to me. If you pause time during a moment of joy, a wedding, a birth, a reunion, would that joy remain preserved for you, like a flower pressed between the pages of memory? Or would it feel hollow, knowing the laughter cannot finish, the hug cannot tighten, the kiss cannot land? To touch joy while it waits might feel like holding your breath underwater. Beautiful at first, but aching quickly. Perhaps joy requires motion, the rise and fall, the giving and receiving. Without it, even happiness might feel like a picture instead of a song. And what about knowledge itself? If you had endless hours in a paused world, could you study endlessly, mastering languages, sciences, arts? Or would you find that the pause denies you even this? That the world of knowledge only breathes when it is shared, when a teacher speaks, when a student answers, when debate sparks and questions clash. Alone in frozen hours, could you truly learn? Or would you only memorize shadows of understanding without context to bring them alive? Then I think of time as a healer. Wounds mend, grief softens, children grow, all because time moves. If you paused it, healing itself would halt. A cut would not close, a seed would not sprout, a child would not learn to walk. Would it feel cruel to hold back the very force that allows life to continue? Could you bear the sight of a world denied its chance to change, even for a single day? Or would you remind yourself that the pause is temporary, and that all will move again soon enough? In the end, I circle back to one quiet truth. Pausing time reveals how much we depend on movement not just for survival, but for meaning. History, art, love, laughter, even grief. Each is alive because it flows, because it begins, swells, and ends. To stop it is to see its beauty in stillness, but also to feel its fragility. So here is the question I leave with you. If you could pause time in any single moment of history, just once, where would you go? Would you step into a hall of kings, a battlefield, a quiet village? Would you seek greatness, or the small lives that slip past unnoticed? And when time began again, would you return changed, carrying not just the image of that frozen moment, but the understanding that what gives life its meaning is not the pause, but the motion that follows? What would morality mean if no one could see what you chose? Our sense of right and wrong is often shaped by the presence of others, by the gaze that notices, the voice that responds, the society that reacts. But if time stood still for everyone except you, would your moral compass hold steady, or would it begin to waver when you realized no one could ever know? Do you believe goodness matters only when it is witnessed, or does it hold weight even when it lives only in your own memory? Picture yourself walking through a city, every shop open, every vault unlocked, every treasure waiting without guard. You could take anything, money, jewels, paintings, secrets. No one would stop you, no one would accuse you, no one would even remember. Would you reach out, or would you hesitate, feeling the invisible weight of your own conscience pressing on your hand? Sometimes the truest judge is not the world, but the quiet voice that follows you when no one else does. Would that voice be loud enough in silence? And what about kindness? If you saw someone frozen in an awkward stumble, about to fall, would you steady them? If you saw a letter slipping from someone's hand, would you tuck it back safely? No one would know you had helped. No thanks, no recognition. But perhaps that is the purest form of kindness, the kind that exists even when invisible. Could you find joy in that? Or would the absence of acknowledgement leave you hollow? Then comes the temptation of mischief. Imagine rearranging the frozen world just slightly. A hat tilted, a chair moved, a street sign turned. When time resumed, people would blink, puzzled, perhaps laugh, perhaps frown? Would you feel guilty for confusing them, or delighted by the small chaos you created? Is harmless mischief still harmless when no one understands its source? Or does it become unsettling, a reminder to others that their world is not quite as stable as they thought? And what of intimacy? If someone you love is frozen, you could whisper words you've never dared to say, secrets too heavy for daylight. They would never hear, never answer. Would you feel lighter, confessing in silence, or heavier, realizing that intimacy requires exchange and without it, the words are only echoes? Perhaps love in a paused world becomes a mirror, showing you what you long to share, even when you cannot. Consider justice. If you stumbled into a scene where harm was about to unfold, someone about to be struck, someone about to be robbed, would you intervene? You could move the weapon, push the assailant's arm, place the victim out of harm's way. No one would know you had acted, but lives might change because of it. Would you step in even if you would never be thanked? And what if you found yourself tempted to harm instead, knowing no punishment would follow? Which path would your hand choose when the only witness is your own reflection? The pause becomes a stage where morality is stripped bare. Without society's laws, without the eyes of friends or strangers, what guides you? Is it fear of being caught, or love of what is right? The pause asks, who are you when no one else can see? Think too about truth. Secrets live everywhere. Letters in drawers, files in cabinets, messages waiting to be read. In pause time, you could open them all. Would you search for what others hide? Would you want to know what they never meant to share? And if you learned their secrets, would it bring you closer to them, or would it place a wall between you, knowledge separating rather than uniting? Sometimes ignorance is not weakness, but mercy. Could you resist the urge to pry? And what about creation? Suppose you used the paused hours not for theft or secrecy, but to build. You plant flowers in a barren lot, paint murals across blank walls, arrange books into new patterns. When time resumes, no one knows you worked. People wake to beauty with no source. Would you feel joy in their wonder, even if they never knew it was you? Could anonymous creation feel like the highest form of generosity? Or would you feel the pang of invisibility, longing for your effort to be recognized? Imagine standing before a stranger paused mid-step. Their expression is tense, brows furrowed. Would you be tempted to smooth their hair, to soften their pose, to arrange them more gently? Is that kindness, or is it intrusion, altering them without permission? The pause raises uncomfortable questions about consent. When no one can say yes or no, what right do you have to act? Perhaps morality in such a world is not about laws, but about restraint. The power to act does not mean you should. And then the question of memory returns. If you chose mischief, kindness, theft, or restraint, no one else would ever remember. Only you would. Would your memory be enough to sustain you, or would it eat at you, knowing you alone carried the weight? If you rescued someone silently, would you revisit that memory with pride, or bitterness that they never thanked you? If you crossed a moral line, would you bury it, or would it haunt you more deeply because it existed only inside you? Perhaps the pause shows that morality is not about external rules at all, but about the stories we tell ourselves when the world is quiet. Think also of scale. Small actions might feel harmless, but what about larger ones? What if you shifted an entire scene, a courtroom, a negotiation, a vote? Would you feel like a savior or like a manipulator? Would you justify it as justice, or would you wonder if your hand had taken away others' right to choose? Power always tempts justification. Would the silence of the pause make it easier to believe your own reasoning or harder? Even the natural world presents questions. If you plucked a flower during the pause, when time resumed, would it still be missing? If so, would that act count as theft or as creation, offering yourself beauty stolen from a moment? If it reappeared in its place, your action erased, would you feel relieved or cheated? Perhaps morality in a paused world is also about humility, about accepting that not everything you do can or should leave a mark. And what about yourself? If you knew no one could see you, how would you act differently? Would you move with more freedom, dance in the middle of a street, shout into the silence? Or would you feel more cautious, aware that the absence of others made your presence heavier? Sometimes we behave kindly not because someone is watching, but because we need to believe in our own reflection. Would the stillness strengthen that need, or unravel it? I find myself circling back to the simplest question. Does morality depend on time itself? Our choices matter because they ripple forward, because they shape what comes next. In a paused world, where consequences dissolve, is morality still real? Or is it revealed in its purest form, stripped of all reward and punishment, reduced to a single choice? Who do you wish to be when no one will ever know? So let me leave you with this question lingering in the quiet. If you had 24 hours where only you could move, what kind of person would you become? Would you use the silence to take, to meddle, to satisfy curiosity? Or would you use it to give, to protect, to honor what others never see? The paused world may never exist outside imagination, but perhaps the answers it draws from you already matter. Because even now, when no one is looking, your choices reveal who you are. What would it mean to measure time when time itself refuses to move? If you stood in a paused world for 24 hours, how would you even know when those hours ended? Without clocks ticking, without the sun drifting, without shadows stretching across the ground, what markers remain? Would you count your own breaths, one after another, until you lost track? Or would the silence stretch so far that minutes and hours tangled together, leaving you unsure if a day had passed or a lifetime? We think of time as something we see in numbers on a dial or a screen, but really, it's woven into rhythm. The steady beat of heart, the rising and falling of tides, the shifting of light across the sky. In a paused world, those rhythms vanish. A candle would not burn down. A star would not shift. Even the sand in an hourglass would not fall. You would be untethered, drifting in a place where measurement itself has no anchor. Would you find freedom in that, or fear? Could you handle a day without knowing how much of it has slipped away? Perhaps you'd try to invent your own markers. You might pace, counting each step as a stand-in for seconds. You might sing softly to yourself, using the rhythm of your voice as a clock. But what if your pacing faltered, your song slowed or sped up? Would your sense of time unravel until you couldn't tell whether you'd been walking for an hour or a moment? Maybe you'd discover how fragile your perception really is, how much you rely on the world's movement to feel your own life moving forward. Then there's the question of memory. When time flows, memory is anchored to sequence. One moment, then the next, each stacked neatly after the other. But if you lived 24 hours while the world remained still, your memories would exist without external sequence, without markers that tell you how long anything took. Would they blur together like a dream, so that when you returned, you wondered if it had really happened? Or would they burn sharper, etched into you because they belonged only to you? Imagine, too, the strangeness of returning. 1 second, you're alone in silence, and the next, the world surges back, clocks ticking, voices speaking, movement everywhere. To you, a full day has passed, but to everyone else, not a single heartbeat has gone by. Would you feel older, carrying a secret weight of hours they cannot see? Would you feel like you had lived a double life, one in silence and one in motion? And how would you speak of it when to others nothing at all had changed? What of your body? Would your 24 hours add to your age, leaving you just slightly older than those around you? Would your hair grow, your nails lengthen, your cells divide, even while the world's did not? Perhaps you would become a little out of sync with everyone else, each time you paused drifting further ahead, until years later you were noticeably older than those who never paused. Would you regret those stolen days, or treasure them as time you lived fully while others slept? Consider hunger again. If you cannot measure time by clocks or stars, perhaps you measure it by appetite. Morning hunger, afternoon weariness, evening thirst. But what if even your body begins to confuse you? Hunger rises and falls not only with biology but with rhythm. Meals timed with daylight, rest timed with night. In a paused world, without those cues, would you eat too soon or too late, unsure of what hour you lived in? Could your body become as disoriented as your mind, craving patterns that no longer exist? And then there's exhaustion. 24 hours awake in silence could feel longer than any day filled with movement and voices. Without change to break the monotony, fatigue might sink deeper. Would you sleep just to escape the endless sameness? But if you did, how would you know how long you slept? What if you closed your eyes for what felt like an instant and awoke unsure whether your 24 hours had ended, or whether you had dreamed an eternity inside them? Sleep in a paused world might feel like slipping from one silence into another, with no boundary between. I wonder, too, about perspective. Normally, time's passing gives us urgency. Deadlines push us, schedules shape us, the future pulls us forward. In a paused world, urgency dissolves. Nothing approaches, nothing recedes. Everything is suspended. Would you feel liberated, free of pressure, able to act without rush? Or would you feel lost, realizing that urgency is what gives direction to life, that without it, purpose itself begins to blur? Perhaps you would invent your own purposes. You might decide, I will walk this city until my legs ache. I will memorize every detail of a street corner. I will carve meaning into a day that refuses to measure itself. But would those purposes satisfy, or would they feel hollow once the world resumed? Maybe the lesson of the pause is that purpose depends not on stillness, but on motion. The knowledge that things end is what makes them matter. And what of relationships? If you spend 24 hours beside someone you love while they remain frozen, would you feel closer to them or farther away? You'd live through hours of intimacy they never knew, moments you counted but they did not. When time resumed, you might look at them differently with the weight of experiences they cannot share. Would that secret time create tenderness or distance? Perhaps love needs the symmetry of shared hours, not the imbalance of one living while the other waits. Think also of fear. In a paused world, no disaster can strike, no accident unfolds, no danger approaches. You are safe, utterly safe. But safety without change can curdle into unease. Would you begin to crave even the risk of ordinary life, simply to feel alive again? Without uncertainty, perhaps even safety feels like a kind of cage. Could you survive 24 hours of knowing absolutely nothing new would happen except what you made? And then there is the return to motion. Imagine the sound of it, the sudden rush of footsteps, the wind resuming its whisper, the voices spilling back into the air. Would it overwhelm you, like plunging into a river after standing on its bank? Would you laugh at the noise, or cover your ears, aching for silence again? Maybe you'd realize then that time's flow is not just noise but music, and that pausing it is like holding a single note too long. Beautiful, yes, but only because eventually the melody moves forward. What about the very last second before the pause ends? You know your borrowed hours are almost over. Would you rush, trying to squeeze in one last act, one last glance, one last word whispered into the stillness? Or would you stop, breathe, and let the final seconds be calm, preparing yourself for the flood of motion to return? That choice might reveal more about you than anything else. Do you race against endings, or do you accept them with quiet? So the question lingers. If you could pause time for 24 hours but knew you would have no way to measure those hours, how would you live them? Would you fill them with movement, marking your own rhythm against the silence? Or would you surrender to timelessness, letting the hours blur until they dissolved? And when time returned, would you miss the stillness? Or would you be grateful for the tick of clocks, the drift of shadows, the small reminders that life is not meant to be paused, but lived? What would it mean to let go of the power to pause time? If such a gift lay in your hands, a button glowing quietly, the promise of 24 hours of silence whenever you wished, how would you decide when to use it for the very last time? Would you wait for crisis, hoping to save someone in danger? Would you choose a moment of beauty, a sunset or a snowfall, to stretch into eternity? Or would you hold the button too tightly, afraid to spend it, until years passed and you realized you had never pressed it at all? We often imagine power as something that must be used, but perhaps the truest test is whether we can resist it. If you knew you could pause the world, would you still let life flow naturally, trusting its rhythm even when it feels rushed, painful, or fleeting? Could you accept impermanence instead of fighting it? Maybe the real question isn't what you would do with the pause, but whether you need it at all. Think of the moments you already wish could last longer. A conversation that ends too soon, a laugh that fades, a touch that slips away. In a paused world, you could stretch those instants into hours. But would they still feel alive once stretched? A laugh held too long turns strange. A touch without response grows cold. A conversation without exchange becomes silence. Perhaps part of what makes those moments precious is precisely that they end. Would freezing them rob them of their meaning? And then there is grief. Imagine pausing time during the last moments of someone you love, holding them in stillness, refusing to let the end arrive. For you, the hours could stretch forever. But when time resumed, their final breath would still come. Would that long goodbye soothe you, or would it make the loss sharper, teaching you that no amount of stillness can prevent endings? Maybe grief itself is proof that we cannot hold the river still, only cherish what flowed through our hands while we had it. Consider also the weight of solitude. Every time you paused the world, you lived apart from it, separate from its movement. If you pressed the button too often, would you begin to feel split in two, one self in silence, one in motion, never fully belonging to either? Would you become a wanderer between worlds, always longing for what you do not have? Stillness when life is loud, motion when life is still? Could such a gift become less a blessing than a fracture, pulling you further from others with each use? Perhaps that is why the pause feels most powerful in imagination, less so in practice. In thought, it is limitless. In reality, it would be lonely, fragile, heavy with consequences. Maybe the fantasy itself is the gift. It reminds us how much we value presence, how much we long for time to soften. Do we need the button, or do we only need the reminder it brings? That even without stopping the world, we can slow ourselves, noticing, breathing, choosing stillness in small ways? Yet I cannot help but return to wonder. If you had one last use of the pause, how would you spend it? Would you walk through a forest, touching frozen leaves, tracing the veins of still butterflies? Would you stand in a city square, watching raindrops hang like diamonds in the air? Would you climb a mountain and stand among lightning bolts halted mid-sky, the clouds carved in silver threads? Or would you do something far simpler? Sit beside someone you love, watch their expression in peace, and whisper all the words you never found time to say. And what about the return? When the final pause ended, would you feel relief, grateful to rejoin the rushing current? Or would you ache, missing the silence already? Perhaps you'd carry both. Relief that life moves, sorrow that stillness is gone. Would that blend make you more tender toward time itself, less eager to rush, more willing to let moments breathe? Think of how water feels when you cup it in your hand. No matter how tightly you hold, it slips through your fingers. But in that brief grasp, you feel its coolness, its weight, its reality. Time is the same. We cannot keep it, but we can feel it while it passes. The pause tempts us with the illusion of permanence, yet maybe it only teaches us to cup the water more gently, knowing it will slip away but loving it anyway. Imagine, too, how different you would look at others after the pause. If you had walked among them frozen, seen their faces in detail, studied the wrinkles, the smiles, the worries, when time resumed, wouldn't you notice them more? Wouldn't you treasure their motion, their laughter, their voices? Perhaps pausing time makes you realize that the ordinary flow you once overlooked is itself miraculous. Every blink, every gesture, every breath is a reminder that life is not still, and that is its beauty. And then comes the ultimate question. Would you give the button away? If someone else longed for silence, would you place it in their hand, letting them have the chance you no longer need? Or would you destroy it, ensuring no one bears the burden of deciding when to stop the river? Power, after all, can weigh heavier than it frees. Perhaps the kindest act is not to hold it forever, but to let it go. I think the pause is a story we tell ourselves because deep down we long for more time. Not infinite time, not frozen time, but fuller time. Time we do not waste in hurry, in distraction, in fear. The fantasy of the pause points us back to our reality, whispering that the stillness we crave is already here, hidden in every breath, every pause between words, every heartbeat we choose to notice. Do we really need to stop the world? or do we only need to learn how to stop within it? So I leave you with this final question, one that lingers like the echo of a bell. If time itself could be paused forever, would you want it to be? Or would you rather let it flow, fragile and fleeting, knowing that its movement is what makes every laugh, every touch, every sunrise precious? Because in the end, the beauty of life is not that it can be frozen, but that it moves and we move with it. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of the pause, that we do not need eternity to make a moment sacred. We only need to notice it while it's here.